Hi, my name is Shiva Asma, and I'm founder of the science writing company Fancy Comma LLC. We started out just doing science writing, but now we've expanded to digital marketing, strategic communications, and political communications. We basically do it all for our clients. The one thing that unifies all of our work is that we work to simplify the complexity of various concepts in different spaces, including the health, science, business, finance, policy, technology spaces. Um, I myself am a scientist turned science writer. In 2005, I graduated from MIT and then worked at Massachusetts General Hospital doing neuroscience, neuroimaging research. And then from there, I went to Georgetown, where I worked on my PhD in neuroscience, but left with my master's. And the day I left my master's, I signed up for freelancing on a website called Upwork. And from there, I ended up becoming a freelance science writer, mostly by accident, without even realizing that that's what I was doing. So another thing that I had been doing my whole life is work on political campaigns. Uh, Growing up in high school, I worked to elect local candidates. I attended events with the League of Women Voters in my town. So that passion I kept following that passion in college when I worked on I worked on a Senate campaign here in Oklahoma, where I live, trying to elect a Democrat to the Senate. And while we won the primary, we lost the final election because, Oklahoma is a deeply red state. And so most recently, in the 2022 midterms, I helped successfully elect Senator Mark Kelly and Senator John Fetterman by doing canvassing, calling people, by writing, helping come up with tweet ideas, so working on messaging and strategy, and also doing digital grassroots organizing, which is like tweeting with people and talking to them and stuff. And I've been working in politics for about 20 years. I've also worked in Capitol Hill as a legislative intern, where I would copy edit different reports and go to briefings on different topics such as cancer and science issues, rare diseases, and summarize those briefings for the member of Congress so that they would have access to the best information. Sometimes my work in Congress would involve summarizing science for them, like there was a rare genetic disease that I guess was coming up in some of the bills. So the staffers asked me to research this disease for them and come up with a lay summary, because as you know, in Congress, very few people are scientists. Most people have a government, business, law background, and formal scientific training is pretty hard to come by in Congress. But it's interesting because working in Congress, I kind of learned all of these different communication skills, a different mode of communication than I had known in science. In science, we pride ourselves on being rigorous. And part of that rigor is using complex jargon. And I think some of it is just to tell people, hey, I'm smart. Like, I am in science. I know I can use the lingo, but I think one downside of that is that it creates huge gatekeeping problems for science. I've read so many papers that are so difficult to read in science, and they are reading them, looking at the jargon, my first impression is always, wow, this person is really smart. But then when I have to dig into the paper, I'm often rereading things. I'm just like, what is the message here? It'll take me like a good hour, like in graduate school, it would take me a good hour to just get to the point of a paper. And I think that's a really huge problem for science, because you should know what the paper's about just by looking at it and skimming it. And that's something that politicians have done really well. Politicians, when they go, they make a statement, it's very clear what the message is, because I think part of the reason is they talk to lawmakers. They talk to their constituents on a regular basis. They're connected with their constituents, like they're on the same page, because they go on this campaign trail, they chat with people, they talk directly to the people. But scientists don't talk directly to people. So one lesson that we can learn from policymakers, as much as we hate them sometimes for doing most self-interested seeming things is simplify our communication strategy. Make our communication strategy, first of all, reflect the people we're talking to. Sometimes we are talking to other scientists, but they might not be scientists in our field. So let's say you're writing a paper on something really complex. Maybe one good thing about my program at Georgetown was that it was an interdisciplinary program. So we kind of already had to do this because a lot of the stuff we were talking about would be with people in other disciplines. So it forced us to explain everything really well so that someone not in our field could understand it. Because most people in your field, maybe they don't even like reading jargon. They just read the jargon. They don't read the jargon. They just look at the graphs or something. And since they're experts, they can get through the hype. But one really important aspect of science communication is making sure you know your message before you say something. And that's what political people do. They know their message. They're like, hey, we're gonna do a speech on such and such. Scientists don't do that. They're just like, we're gonna write a paper. It's gonna have an introduction, abstract introduction, methods, conclusion, whatever. But the main takeaway, is often kind of an afterthought. But what if we took the main takeaway, thought about it, and then made that the overarching unifying theme of the paper? That's what you're supposed to do in writing, but sometimes that kind of gets lost in science writing. So that's one thing that I learned from the political world. Another thing I learned from the political world is the way you present yourself matters a lot. Like in science, when I was a scientist, I used to wear jeans to lab. I wore any number of casual outfits to the lab. Not so as a DC insider. I would regularly wear suits every day. In fact, when you go to the House floor, you can't wear sleeveless shirts. You have to wear a blazer. So I always had a blazer. Maybe in lab, I had this Forever 21 hoodie that was had gold flecks in it, and I wore that when I was cold. But in Congress, I traded in my American Apparel and my hipster clothes for just Ann Taylor suits. And the vibe is a lot different in Congress. And I think that the vibe in Congress is kind of the vibe in the rest of the world, the business world. Everyone's very professional. They wear suits, they communicate differently, they use those buzzwords that we hate and we make fun of in lab meeting, but that are used a lot because you actually do connect with other people. I used to always get oh, nice to connect with you. Thanks for reaching out. In the science world, we don't really talk like that much. I mean, maybe as a professor you do, but as a graduate student, I just found that so pretentious. But that kind of stuff matters in the political world. And I think that if scientists are going to interface more productively with policymakers to combat these different challenges, that we have to kind of at least know about this mode of communication, very professional mode. It's very appearance-based, whereas in science, we're always evaluating things based on the facts. So, and why is that important? It's important because there are many challenges in the political world that involve science. Climate issues are the main one. Obviously, the pandemic was a huge problem that got hugely politicized, and that was the subject of my science talk last year about creating bipartisan, inclusive science communication for everyone to be able to benefit, because it was really sad to see people in my home state of Oklahoma die and see it not get covered in the news and have all of this media coverage about Republicans that voted for Donald Trump don't want vaccines, when Donald Trump himself was the one that supported Operation Warp Speed. And say what you want about politics, when science gets politicized and scientists don't speak the language of policymakers, that just shifts everything to the policymakers. And as I mentioned, policymakers don't have a science background. So if scientists want to gain political power, political leverage, they have to communicate on the same mode of policymakers, which is to say, communicate simply, get to the point quickly. In Congress, I wrote a white paper once for a reform that was happening in Congress, and I asked my friend who worked in Congress, hey, I've never written a white paper for Congress before, what do I do? And he was like, just get to the point quickly, make the policy ask very clear, and just whenever you use evidence, actually, like, it's like, I mean, include evidence, check the Congressional Research Service, but the main thing was include the policy ask early on and make it very clear, because people in Congress don't have a lot of time. They're always skimming stuff. I wonder how different the pandemic would be if scientists were trained in this kind of very people-based, high-level, figure out what you want to say before you say it type of thing, jargon-free communication. That would have changed the course of the pandemic entirely, because you'd have this politician coming up, like the GOP judiciary once tweeted, if vaccines work, why don't they work? And they ended up deleting that. But it's like, if scientists could have that same strategic communications mind, like, things would be so much different. But the problem is you don't get that from science. In science, you learn the important things of like critical thinking skills, how to test hypotheses, data analysis, like all these hard skills in the sciences. We don't often pay attention to the soft skills, such as writing, like writing a tweet. Like, why would we ever learn about that in graduate school? Or things like how to write a paper that doesn't pass the like jargon vibe check, because that is actually very exclusionary. How to write a paper that anyone can understand, because like your abstract in your scientific paper, I feel like everyone should be able to understand your abstract. Like, if they have a basic knowledge of like science, they should understand it. Then like the intro, anyone should be able to understand it. The methods and all that stuff, maybe that's okay if people don't understand it, but anyone should be able to understand what you're talking about when you're talking about science. And it's not a question of, oh no, I'm making my science less rigorous. It's a question of oftentimes things like limiting passive voice, using stronger verbs to buoy your text, because active verbs draw the attention of the reader and make the reading a lot easier to understand. Things like reviewing your writing once you write it, to see like sending it to someone to be like, is this clear? Like, is this a good piece of writing? Like, how can I improve this? Because in politics, when a politician wants to say something, they don't just, sometimes they wing it. Like when I worked in Congress, sometimes I don't know how politicians prepare for their speeches. I watched a lot of C-SPAN, and sometimes it does sound like they're just rambling about random tangents. But the one thing that they do that scientists don't do is they write their speeches based on the needs of their constituents. That means they talk to their constituents on a regular basis. So they always prepare what they're going to say, and they always make sure that they have their message before they make their speech, because usually they have to take a position on something. So I was just recently watching, I don't know if you guys remember the CHIPS Act that passed a while back. We actually did work on some white papers related to the CHIPS Act for small businesses that were semiconductor manufacturers. But I watched the speeches that were going on in the House of Representatives on C-SPAN, and the one thing that I found really interesting about all of the speeches is that they were all, more than the science, they were all using the science politically. So the science was a huge part of it, because obviously if you don't know science, you won't know that there's a certain advanced semiconductor that before the CHIPS Act was passed there was no infrastructure for it in the United States. And so we would get all of our chips from China, Taiwan. I think there's a place in Europe that makes advanced chips, but it's like everything's tied to Chinese semiconductor manufacturing. And given all of the conflicts going on possibly with Taiwan, both Republicans and Democrats, for different reasons, Republicans because of their kind of wariness of China, and Democrats to the reason was the same, but the way the Republicans and Democrats said it was much more different. Like, conservatives would get up on stage and talk about how China was becoming a huge national security threat. Some Democrats also did that, but the message was, the science was just a small part of the message. It wasn't a scientific speech about like, here's why we need domestic semiconductor manufacturing. Because that's what I would have done if I, as a scientist, like I would step onto the podium, I would just give them an explainer of semiconductor manufacturing, history of semiconductor manufacturing. Here's the history of semiconductor manufacturing, like whatever. No, that's not how it works in Congress. The Congress people got up there and they just started talking about why this matters to people, why this makes science better, why this makes technology better. This actually lowers the cost of semiconductor, smartphones, TVs, anything that has semiconductors in it. So we don't communicate in that mode as scientists. We would just constantly just want to give explainers to everyone, like, here's what you should know about such and such. Like, if you don't understand this, it's on you. And that's why we failed so much in the pandemic with our science communications, because we were like, here's a bunch of facts, like, we're scientists, like, we live and die for this stuff, but like, here's some facts for you. And then people would just, everyday people, like, read the facts, they'd be like, I can't relate to this. Like, first of all, I can't understand this. It doesn't address any of my concerns. Like, if I want to get the COVID vaccine, I've heard all this weird stuff about it. I kind of don't want to put this in my body. And like scientists would just be like, no, oh my God, like facts, facts, facts. But in policy, unlike in science, the facts are just kind of an afterthought. Like scientists will persuade you using emotion. They will appeal to all of your like things that try to give you hope for like a greater tomorrow. Because I've recently forayed into speech writing in addition to being my high school valedictorian and graduation speaker. I've revisited speech writing, and I've got, as part of Speechwriters of Color, I've been able to learn about different methods of speech. What am I trying to say here? Different methods of public speaking. And one thing that is interesting, because I've read some speech writing books by Obama speechwriters, I've like Zoomed with Joe Biden speechwriters, and the one thing that's unifying is that it's about ideas. It's never about like facts. Like no one ever uses facts in policy. So it's really interesting because like how can you write a speech that's like not about facts? It's about like, here's what the America is that we like we can have a better America with like such and such, and like semiconductors will help reduce the cost of something. Like notice that they didn't even talk about here's how a semiconductor works and here's why we need advanced semiconductor manufacturing in the US. Is just about like the big picture. So because the truth is that all science has a big picture, and the big picture is what better living through science. The big picture is always like better living through science, learning more about science so that we can make new discoveries, unlocking the potential of science to treat people. When I advocated for science on Capitol Hill, I would always talk about the potential of biomedical science to translate to new therapies. So the one thing politicians get that we don't have as scientists is thinking large, thinking people-centered, not spouting facts at people, and thinking about our message before we talk. If we as scientists and science communicators could do that, then the state of science literacy, public trust in science, and so on would be so much improved. And finally, I also wanted to make a small note about bipartisanship, because science is highly politicized, and sometimes I feel like people don't realize that science is highly bipartisan. Like if you think about science funding, federal science funding for the National Institutes of Health and National Science Foundation, that money comes from the Congress, and it's always passed by both Republicans and Democrats. And so I think many scientists are like there are very many progressive scientists. Like it's rare for me to meet a Republican scientist, and I think that's kind of a problem for science and for science communication, because if without diversity of opinion, we won't be able to have like the impact we want. Because if we're just preaching to the choir all the time on our Democrat issues, then we're never going to truly achieve any meaningful bipartisan reforms. So that's one thing to keep in mind. So I think I'm nearing the end of my 20 minutes. I pledged that I would just get on my phone and ramble and record this for Science Talk, Association for Science Communicators, and it looks like I've been successful. So thank you for listening to my talk. Feel free to follow me at Shiva Ozma or at Fancy Comma. Visit me on the web at www.fancycomma.com, shivaozma.com. I'd love to chat with you more about this topic and see how we can improve science communication. Have a great rest of your conference.